Hi, this is Paul. This is part 5. So remember, Sam said 4. Hank said 10. We're up to 5. I don't know who's going to buy a Chicago pizza, Hank or Sam. But this is part 5 of working through the Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke video. Now, what was really nice was the way that this video and then John's question and answer on bridges of meaning really dovetailed and in this area quite nicely. So I'm going to pick it up a little before where I left off in the other. Jordan was again talking about culture war stuff, and the video that I commented on some of the bridges of meaning discussion was also on the culture war stuff. And I really loved in that video, if you haven't watched the video of John Vervaeke's question and answer at the bridges of meaning Discord, I thought he, in a much, well, Nick didn't interrupt him as much as Jordan did, but John really nicely laid out how John deals with this question of postmodernity and why it's inadequate to deal with what John Vervaeke's main goal is. He wants to get at reality, truth. I mean, he's a searcher. He's a searcher for truth, for reality, to see and to know. So I'm gonna pick it up here and continue on in this. We'll see how many more it takes.
So you said the answer to nihilism. That isn't exactly a comment on my comment that the culture war is about a claim that the drive to power is at the core of Western being.
I think that's an equally nihilistic claim. That's my point. The claim,
the claim is nihilistic, or my claim about that is nihilistic, or both.
That power is a fundamental reality is an attempt to assuage the wounding of nihilism, but it is fundamentally mistaken in its endeavor. It is constituted the wrong way. It's like framing a problem the wrong way, so that you do not get the insight needed to get to the solution of the problem. So I think of it as a fundamental misframing. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay,
and that's why I'm hesitant to say either yes or no to it, because
I get it.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I believe that it is misframed, because I don't think it would be taking us in such a pathological direction. The whole argument,
exactly,
if it wasn't misframed.
You know, just a thought. What are these videos? Except my thoughts while I'm watching this. It's also been a few weeks now since this has come out, which I think is helpful because it affords perspective. But given, Jordan is at this point, well, he's not well enough. There was a note on Twitter a couple of days ago from Jordan's account, either from Jordan or someone who is managing his account for him, basically saying that he sort of has to take a step back. His akathisia is back to a degree, and I suspect he's got a few of these talks already in the can, as it were, and that's part of the reason why they've gone down to a weekly release instead of two a week. He's probably got a bunch of these that are already laid up, because as in John Vervaeke's case, it was released about a month after. So the channel will continue to be able to produce content, and I certainly hope and pray, and my prayers are with Jordan and his family, that the akathisia can subside, and that he can once again, pursue these conversations, which he's really pursuing. And there's another one coming out on psychedelics. And there's been some of you have sent me some other videos by the same author, and so I'm going to be looking at that a little bit more. The whole psychedelic question is an interesting question philosophically when it gets into these questions of, I'd say, inside versus outside. Of, I don't like subjective, objective, that framing. We could say public, but anyway. My point, the reason I interrupted these two, my point is that given everything that has happened to Jordan over the last 5 years, another aspect of this conversation that I think is healthy is Jordan being able to talk to a colleague about some of the issues that drove Jordan to make the decisions that he did, which eventually led him to, he's not a professor. I don't know. He's probably still, his status is likely still with University of Toronto. I haven't heard that there's been any official status with respect to that. He had a sabbatical, then he was on leave, and he certainly would be subject to health leave, but I don't know if he could ever go back and be a professor there. And so I mean, John Vervaeke he's a very careful speaker, and he has, really worked hard to stay out of the political fray. He doesn't believe that that's not the aspect of this conversation that he wants to be involved in, and I completely agree with that. I perhaps touch on political things a little bit more than he does, partly because as a pastor, my domain is a little bit more broad, but as a pastor too, I try to differentiate my work from the political aspect. And the work of Jordan's that I'm most interested in is obviously the religious aspect. But I thought it's really helpful to have a conversation about some of the culture war stuff that Jordan wants to talk about from an academic point of view with respect to are we talking about Foucault and Derrida and postmodernity in a credible way, a way that is fair and not just straw manning, but to do some more serious analysis. And so I think this conversation between John and Jordan did achieve at that. And Jordan was able to talk with a colleague about postmodernity and compare notes. I had a friend who I was the president of a board, and he was the director of the agency. I was the president of the board agency. He was the director of the agency. This is within the church. And he lived in Ontario and had to continually travel back and forth to Michigan, and always had to deal with the U.S. customs to get in and out. And so his answer to the standard question of why are you traveling, because whenever you'd mention any employment, suddenly everything would get weird at the border because, well, are you going into the other country, taking a job away from a national, et cetera, et cetera? He'd always say, I'm going to compare notes. That's all we tell him. I'm going to compare notes. So I really liked here John and Jordan are comparing notes on postmodernity, and I found it very helpful.
And so part of what I'm trying to, and for me, this dovetails with the increasing crescendo within 4E cognitive science about embodiment and embedded and extended and enacted cognition is most
right. You see this as a subset argument of one of those elements.
Yes.
But I mean, that's a huge, but like I said, I'm really having a hard time. I know what you mean, and I suppose what you're trying to do with everything you do is to expound upon this, but I certainly want you to expound upon this. Let's go into those three modes of alternate cognition a little bit more deeply.
Okay, so the first distinction, of course, was classically made by Ryle, and we even carry it in psychology when we make distinctions of our own procedural memory and things like that, which this is the distinction between propositional, knowing that something is the case, in which what you're trying to do is basically assert, the truth of the semantic content of a proposition. Right,
and that's akin to the proposition that to believe in God is to accept a set of propositions about the nature of God. Yes, and that's what always strikes. That's why I never answer that question, because I think that's the wrong framing of the question, so I can't answer it.
Exactly.
Okay, well, man, you're helping me out here. So because you're helping me differentiate my sense of the non-propositional space. And I mean, I know some of this.
And I could see how, this is an area where, yes, some collaboration would be helpful because John has developed these 4 Ps, and Jordan has, I think, rightly sort of hinted at it. I think one of the aspects that both of these two will have to deal with is that modern science is a subdomain of modernity, and in that way is deeply dependent upon propositionality in a way, is deeply dependent on propositionality. And so some of the limitations of propositionality also limit the domain of science. And that curtails, or should curtail, the ambition of science to be a totalizing discipline, which is at the heart of many of the people like Krauss. I finished listening to it, and he said, towards the end of that conversation, Peterson's like, well, religion asks, why? And Krauss then says something like, well, all why questions should just be basically dispelled by how questions. And I think, but the problem is that 2 minutes later, he just, using science, explained, and this is why this is his reason for being. And it's like, you can't live like you are prescribing. It isn't possible. And you betray your agenda within moments of asserting it. So anyway, so as we continue these conversations about science and religion, and this is, I think, a big part of what Jordan continues to try to work on, because in many ways he, more than many, I think, really takes the challenge of science and religion seriously from both ends, instead of what some religious people do, which is sort of just, dispel science, and what some scientific people just dispel religion. Well, neither are going to be dispelled. They both have their proper domain. Towards the end of the Krauss conversation, when Peterson is talking to Krauss, and Peterson says, well, perhaps we need a fourth, he's looking at the American three, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, the executive branch, that there needs to be a symbolic branch. And he was talking about parliamentary, monarchies. And, it reminded me of Abraham Kuyper's sphere sovereignty, and you can look that up in Wikipedia for a brief look at it. But science has its sphere, and what we're really trying to do is trying to figure out the appropriate domains and how these different forms of knowledge interact with their appropriate domain. And that very much gets into, to a degree, Abraham Kuyper's neo-Calvinist ideas around sphere sovereignty, which he put into place to one degree or another in the Netherlands in the beginning of the 20th century. He was a Dutch Reformed theologian, and he also became the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. So he obviously had a political philosophy as well.
Because I know that the knowing what and knowing how circuitry is separate.
Yep.
I've known that since I wrote Maps of Meaning. And I know the insight circuitry is separate. And that's what I've been getting at also with regards to this idea of revelation and then critical thinking, which we started all this with and never got back to, even though it's just a trivial issue.
We're following the logos. We're following the logos in love.
God, I hope so.
That logos is not very static.
Yep.
I hope so, John, because it's certainly the only justification for my existence, Red Skull and all.
I think there are many reasons that justify your existence, my friend.
Yeah, well.
And that's, you could see where, and Peterson has talked about this a lot, and how this culture war stuff weighs on him. I got an email from someone that basically had attached to it a 35-page PDF about how Jordan Peterson is a neo-Nazi. And I skimmed through that thing just aghast at, one of the examples of an argument would be, you see what Jordan's got, how he's got his finger on his lip. Aha, see? And, the arguments are deserving, are about at the level of a Monty Python sketch, and these are the kinds of arguments that this email and this 35-page PDF had. And, well, again, as a Christian, part of how I deal with this is part of what Christianity affords is, if you believe that your final judge is an audience of one, which is God, and, so one of my Mormon homeless people He's always like, when me and Jesus Christ, we're a majority. It's one of the things that he says all the time. But there's a degree of confidence that affords. And, the Red Skull attacks and all of these attacks by high status, powerful people in the culture war, it's hurt him. And it makes me sad and it makes me angry, because I haven't watched every single video on his channel, but I've watched easily a majority of them, and I've watched many of them multiple times through, and I've watched his class lectures, which he recorded, and to call him a neo-Nazi is just preposterous. And yet in this silly culture war, it's a sin.
I think that's an inadequate self-appraisal. But
thank you, John. That's vastly appreciated.
So I think you would admit, and I think there's been a growing consensus from the failure of computational cognition or even behaviorist we can't reduce consciousness.
Why failure, John?
Because what we've noticed is that consciousness doesn't seem to be something that's explicatable in terms of the logical relations between propositions.
It's not propositional.
Right,
Very good.
exactly.
Very
Okay.
good.
And
So
it's
you
not-
think
and it's not-
we've actually found that out, eh? And that's the failure. Does that mean the failure of AI as it's
Now, when he says you think we've actually found that out, again, this is sort of science as certainty. And consciousness is not propositional. I certainly agree with the statement, but this quest for certainty, it's completely human. It is a human quest. It is itself not a propositional quest. It very much gets into some of the McGilchrist stuff. But when we should pause when we imagine we have grasped some of this certainty. I'm not trying to be a skeptic, but I just wanted to note that.
presently constituted?
It depends, because what's happening in AI is the AI is moving off a sort of
Propositions.
The idea that cognition is computation and that the mind is a formal system is being replaced with the.
Now, this again is, well, what does he mean? The mind is a formal system. Well, he actually dealt with that in the Bridges of Meaning conversation.
The new astronomy. And so it was like, aha, but there is a language of the universe. That's what Galileo called it. And that's math. And that's why you got the prioritization of math, and then everything tries to imitate math. So we get the idea of knowledge as a formal system, right? A formal logical mathematical system. So a purely structural, as the postmodernists will later say, because they also call themselves post-structuralists, this purely formal structure, and all we're going for is logical coherence. And then that brings the third thing, which is reason is nothing but logic. Reason is nothing but logic. Okay, so all of those three actually fit together very, very profoundly, if you think about it.
Now we're in, just to track it, now we're in like Kripke, Hilbert.
The idea that the mind is an embodied autopoietic dynamical system, and that thinking isn't in the head. It's the way the embodied brain is dynamically coupled to the world in an ongoing evolution of your sensory motor, right?
You mean hence the justification?
I think there's in there also a deep critiquing of individualism, that we, for the most part, our assumptions are, here we are as individuals, and again, we are individuals, we should be treated as individuals, but the thinking that we're doing is not something that we're just simply doing on our own between our ears. It's something that we are actually doing together. And I think, so why on earth do you watch me think along with these other thinkers and you think along with me. How does this help us? Well, this is sort of a validation of what John just articulated, that thinking is a communal enterprise. And I did 3 conversations yesterday about the church, and they'll probably come out later. I did one with Karen from the Meaning Code. I did another one with Sarah from the Netherlands. And I did another one with Anders from Arizona. And in all of them, you know, the church was sort of the focus. And part of the reason why, you know, we're working on estuary and why as a pastor I work on church is that this thinking and especially this believing, and I don't mean believing in a strictly propositional way, this believing together that we do in the church is very much in line with what John has just laid out. This is what the church is for. The church is for a thinking community, to be a thinking community, a thinking, believing, living together community. Today I had a conversation with Matthias. That will come out before this video because I'm going to put that out Friday morning, who grew up in a Mennonite community in Germany. And of course, Julian in our channel, and you can find him much more frequently on the Randos channel. You know, Julian participates in a very serious Hutterite communal living situation. And so part of what the church creates is, in fact, these thinking and believing and living together communities. And the goal of this is, in fact, to grow in agency and to grow in knowledge of God. Now, again, when I say knowledge of God, we think about that in this siloed, modernistic, secularist sense that knowledge of God is somehow a religious thing. But I want to point back to the early days of modernity when you look at someone like Galileo or Newton. In many ways, when they are measuring gravity and working out Newtonian mechanics, they are pursuing the mind of God and desiring to know God better. Well, what God? Well, God number one. And how do we know this God? We know this God by this transjective relationship with God. And in fact, and Christianity has done this all along, we do this in community. And so a big part of the development of Christianity throughout the ages has been the development of the Christian community and the norms within the Christian community, which in many ways not only has the morality of Christianity, as Tom Holland has shown, deeply penetrated and really captured a great deal of Western morality, are relational assumptions about equality and brotherhood, for the most part, have captured the Western imagination. And we try to, in many ways, approximate this even within the state. Nationalism is in some ways an attempt to apply Christianity in geopolitical ways in the West. Democracy certainly is. And again, this gets into this debate about sphere sovereignty. Well, maybe I should put it right in this video too.
Panel at Oxford, you said, was it Oxford?
It was the Oxford Union debate. Yeah.
Okay. So, and I know you're also interested in social transformations and what's happening in the universities, and you described the crowd at Oxford as woke. So I'm going to tell you something I've been thinking about. I'd like you to tell me what you think about it.
Oh, sure.
So, I was thinking for a long time about the advantages of a democratic monarchy like Great Britain. Okay, so imagine instead of executive, legislative, and judicial, there's 4 branches of government.
Okay.
Legislative, judicial, executive, and symbolic. Okay, and so it's helpful to have the Queen, because then the president isn't the Queen.
Yeah.
Or the president isn't the king.
That's the great thing about a constitutional monarchy. You and I both have lived in Canada and the United States, and I agree.
Okay, so you can so you might say that in a place where there is no 4th branch of government, the president, the executive, tends to take on the symbolic weight of the king.
Yeah.
Okay, we agree on that. That's possible anyways.
Absolutely.
Okay,
I think it's one of the problems of American politics. Yeah.
Okay, and now I would say that's also related to the problem of the separation of church and state. And one of the things the West seems to have got right is the idea that we should render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God's.
Now, this area would be a fascinating area to talk to Jonathan Peugeot about, because in one of my conversations with him, he basically said, well, I'm basically a monarchist. And that does very much flow from the Orthodox kingdoms of the East. You had a and to a degree, the constitutional monarchies of the West. I mean, the Queen is the protector of the church. And in the West, they developed this dance, and Tom Holland writes about it in his book Millennium, or I forget, it has 2 titles. I bought the Millennium book, even though I had the other book. Got it from the UK. And in the West, they had, throughout the medieval period, they had this long dance of power struggle between Pontiff and Emperor, and that goes all the way back to Constantine. So, this has been something that we've been working on for a very long time. And so now Jordan is suggesting that perhaps a 4th symbolic branch would be appropriate to differentiate these roles.
Well,
it's an analogous idea. That's okay. You don't. I'll just continue where I'm going.
I need that to be described more, but okay, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, imagine there's a practical necessity for the separation of the religious impulse from the political impulse. But imagine that there's a psychological necessity for that too.
Okay.
And that if there aren't domains specified out for the different domains of practical thought, political, economic, religious, then they contaminate each other. And what happens is you don't get rid of the religion. You contaminate the politics with it.
Now, or as the president of the Southern Baptist Conference said, every time church and politics gets in bed, church gets pregnant, and the child doesn't look like Jesus. So I would argue that when church and politics get too closely intertwined, the church gets corrupted. And in fact, both get corrupted. And this is something of what's behind the ideas of Abram Kuyper in terms of sphere sovereignty. And you can find this on Wikipedia. In Neo-Calvinism, sphere sovereignty is known as differentiated responsibility. It's the concept that each sphere or sector of life has its own distinct responsibilities and authority or competence and stands equal to other spheres of life. Sphere sovereignty involves the idea of an all-encompassing created order, and those of you who keep going back and forth with me about natural law, you can see created order is sort of the Dutch Calvinist alternative phrase to natural law. I prefer created order. I'm a Dutch Calvinist. Designed and governed by God. This created order includes societal communities, such as those for the purposes of education, worship, civil justice, agriculture, economy and labor, marriage and family, artistic expression, etc., their historic development and their abiding norms. The principle of sphere sovereignty seeks to affirm and respect creational boundaries and historical differentiation. And so when I was listening to Peterson say this, I thought, he's taken a page out of Abram Kuyper. Sphere sovereignty implies that no one area of life or societal community is sovereign over another. Each sphere has its own created integrity. Neo-Calvinists hold that since God created everything after its own kind, diversity must be acknowledged and appreciated. For instance, the different God-given norms of family life and economic life should be recognized, such that a family does not properly function like a business. Similarly, neither faith institutions, churches, nor institutions of civil justice, the state, should seek totalitarian control or any regulation of human activity outside their limited competence, respectively. The concept of sphere sovereignty became the general principle in European countries governed by Christian democratic political parties who held it as an integral part of their ideology. The promotion of sphere sovereignty by Christian Democrats led to the creation of corporatist welfare states throughout the world. And of course, plenty of all of this can and has been debated. Sphere sovereignty is an alternative to worldviews of ecclesiasticism and secularism, especially in its statist form. During the Middle Ages, A form of papal monarchy assumed that God ruled over the world through the church. Ecclesiasticism is widely evident in the arts. Religious themes are encouraged by art's primary patron, the church. Similarly, the politics of the Middle Ages often consists of political leaders during the state instituted. On and on. Some say that, well, as Christian democratic parties were formed, they adopted the principle of sphere sovereignty, with both Protestants and Roman Catholics agreeing that the principles of sphere sovereignty and subsidiarity boil down to the same thing. Although this is at odds with Dooyeweerd's development of sphere sovereignty, which he held to be a significant distinction from subsidiarity. And of course, the further this goes, the more debated it would be. The doctrine of sphere sovereignty has many applications. The institution of the family, for example, does not come from the state. For example, unlike in the Roman Catholic tradition, Christian schools in the Dutch Reformed tradition and many Christian Reformed churches, despite the smallness of their communities, launched Christian day schools, and they did so, and the pastors weren't in charge of the day schools. They were basically family associations that created the day schools. The pastor might come and do chapel or something like that, but pastors don't run the day schools. In Dutch Christian Reformed churches, pastor doesn't run the church. There's a council, there's a board. They run the church. The pastor doesn't. And see, a lot of these ideas have been deeply impacted many of the forms of what we do in our culture. But, this to a degree gets at questions of education. And so, for example, the kinds of, again, in the Christian Reformed Church, parental associations run the school and collaborate with others. And this reached its peak. It's still bandied about in my tradition. In the Netherlands, it sort of was worked out in pillarization. Kuyper himself founded the Free University, where ministers of the Reformed Church of the Netherlands could be educated without interference from the Dutch state, because educating ministers lies beyond the sphere of civil government in Kuyper's view. And so there was an earlier split off in the church, the Afscheiding, that Kuyper's groups then eventually came together with to become the Christian Reformed Church, which was an alternative to the state church. And the Free University and Free Church are separate from these state churches. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting reading some of these and listening to what Peterson had to say.
Justification for freedom of speech.
Right.
You mean hence the justification for freedom of speech, you might say.
Well, and also the
freedom of action.
Freedom of action, and also, a freedom for people to explore different ways in which they inhabit their body. I think that's also an important thing. So I did want to get back, though. So if we...
when he said that, I've listened to this a few times, obviously, and different ways for people to inhabit their body. Within the context of a point of the integral nature of a human being, that form of differentiation, which I'm not denying, seems odd. It sort of reminds me of what a psychologist might call disassociation of a person from their body, which I think very consistently in John's schema would be seen as a disorder, because the ideal would be whole integration between a living nephesh, as the Hebrews would call it, not a strong body mind division.
If there's a growing plausibility, so much so that, for example, Bernardo Castro, and I take him seriously. I don't agree with him, but Bernardo is a sharp guy. He proposes a kind of absolute idealism.
Who is that? I don't know him.
Bernardo Castro. So Bernardo is so convinced.
I haven't listened to John's conversation with Bernardo. Bernardo was recommended to me fairly early on in my videos, and I haven't really paid him much attention.
And he's a very sharp guy, that the arguments of trying to reduce consciousness computationally, et cetera, have failed, that he is willing to advocate for, and I don't agree with him on this, but he makes a plausible case that reality, absolute idealism, that consciousness is the ultimate reality. And whether or not that's the case, I'm making a weaker claim on the basis of that. I'm taking that as evidence that there is a growing consensus that the attempt to, explain consciousness computationally, or even just in terms of sort of behaviorist set of skills or something like that, I think that's failed. So to go back to the four kinds of knowing, you've already acknowledged the propositional.
Yeah, sorry, I want to inject one more thing here that's yes. relevant to what you just said, if you don't mind.
I don't mind at all.
Well,
Jordan should start doing commentary videos on the people that he talks to. I mean, I can't point the finger at him for interjecting, because that's all these videos are.
I think the atheist critique of religion is a critique at a propositional level.
I've made this similar point, Jordan. I've made the point that they're not paying attention to. I mean, when Nietzsche runs into the marketplace, he is talking to the atheists when he says, "You don't know what you've done when you've killed God." Right? And so to think that religion is primarily about asserting propositions for which there is no evidence.
And the God that the atheists attempt to kill is a propositional God. And what we've seen in the culture is that even if they manage to shame and exorcise this propositional God out of the culture, plenty of other gods leak in through the bottom.
Is to miss all of the non-proposition. So I make a distinction, and it lines up with this. I think that religion is not primarily about knowledge. I think it's primarily about wisdom, because wisdom is about that fundamental.
It's about embodying it.
The problem that comes when I deny a video that I want to do and I wind up mashing it up with the other video that I decided to do, this is exactly an example of it. But I think these conversations, if you set them side by side, there's some very interesting relationships that develop.
And so now I've been watching what's been happening to Richard Dawkins, for example.
Yeah.
Right. And now Richard's idea, and I'm an admirer of Dawkins. He can think, he's brilliant. And I've read his books. I understand what he's doing and why. And I get his argument. I think it's incomplete for reasons we could get into and probably will. But I think there's something missing there. And then it's playing out is that when you remove the religious sphere and you confuse it with superstition, or you fail to...
Yeah. So this week I'm working on Paul and Barnabas go to Cyprus, and there's a Jewish magi named Bar Jesus, and Paul basically says he's a charlatan, dresses him down, curses him, and he becomes blind for a while, and the proconsul of Cyprus then becomes a believer. Okay, superstition. Where are we going to put the boundaries around that? And believe you me, I am not a pastor of a Pentecostal church. And as some of the conversations that I talked with this week, my college years, I went to a charismatic Christian Reformed church. And some of you might think that's an oxymoron. Well, no, not really. It was charismatic in its own Christian Reformed way. And so I participated in plenty of healing services and a whole variety of things, okay? And so I've got plenty of my own skepticisms and BS meters about all sorts of things that fly in the church. But part of the issue is modernity sort of tried to create a nice clean space by saying, here's the natural, here's the supernatural. The problem is, where is the symbolic in there? Because it isn't nice and discreetly contained. And the line between natural and supernatural is not a line that people, it's not a line that people obey. You can shame them out of it. And now this is a very big deal, because this was in many ways exactly what the Enlightenment wanted to address and rein in, and in some ways also the Protestant Reformation too. And in fact, the embrace of propositionality was exactly designed to address this, because if we could limit ourselves to correspondence between language and objects, well, then we could sort of get all the superstition out of the way. And if we could say that, perhaps, to use this language that I don't like, the objective and the subjective never touch. But that won't wash in Jordan's space, and it won't wash in Jordan's life. So, a little careful about the easy breezy use of that word superstition.
To discriminate here, and you confuse it with superstition, or you fail to discriminate between the valid elements of it and the superstitious elements, you don't get rid of the religious impulse. It goes somewhere else.
Oh, yeah.
And I think where
If you're saying it's going into secular religiosity now,
well, what do you think?
I agree.
I mean, what does it look like to you?
No, that's I said that I've written on it, and that was my argument, is that we're seeing many of the aspects of religion being manifest in secular arguments. As someone pointed out, the only difference being, unlike at least the Christian religion, there's no possibility of absolution, which is
but that's not funny,
yeah, I know,
right?
it's
That's
not funny.
seriously not funny.
I know.
But I agree with you.
I know it's serious and not funny. Believe me, I know it very well.
I know you do. I know, but that also points out what a remarkable achievement the idea of absolution is, because it's like the presumption of innocence. Those two things are miraculous.
Yeah, well, I agree.
Miraculous constructions.
That's why you got to be careful about this, getting rid of superstition and then using the word miraculous out. What exactly do you mean by using that M word right there?
Constructs of thought.
I agree, and I I'm glad we're having this discussion. One of the when you talked about the symbolic, one of the problems I sometimes have with you from having read you in the past, and we'll talk about this, is you say things and I don't really understand what they mean. I mean, they're sufficiently vague. I find them vague enough that I really want them to know how you're defining things, and I've really
he's a little frightened by the woo.
Really enjoyed
Great.
The fact that you've been defining things, and I think so I would agree with you completely. We have to realize, and I've had this discussion, as you probably know, Richard and I have had discussions on a lot. There's a movie about us called The Unbelievers, and we spent a lot of time together, and I think our views have come together in different ways. I would argue that religion on the whole has not been a good thing for people. Okay, that's the first argument. But
Again, yes. Which eye are you looking after when you're making that sweeping value judgment?
But we shouldn't realize, we have to realize that in order that it does serve an evolutionary purpose.
When he says religion is not a good thing, that is a statement of dogma from his church. It is purely that. In the same way that someone who is ordained in my church will, when put in a spot, have to say things like, Jesus is the Son of God. It's just dogma from his church.
If you want to call it purpose. It's there because it has survived all of societies because it meets some human needs in one way or another. And therefore, we have to ask, what needs does it satisfy, and realize what they are, and how can we provide them without the fairy tales?
Why do fairy tales exist? What function do they play? And again, this is, of course, Jordan Peterson's, one of the main points that he made is that fairy tales are not arbitrary. Again, for Peterson, they are evolutionarily purified dreams and mythology. And that's where, when Peterson would call them dreams, again, then he's sitting right next to C.S. Lewis, because what did Lewis call the other world religions? These are good dreams, and the reason Lewis used that because these other world religions are dreams, and in waking up, you see Jesus in the flesh. The Logos becomes flesh. So, but this dismissal about fairy tales, well, just keep watching, because he's about to do something that I almost fell off my chair when I saw it. So get rid of the fairy tales. He obviously has never read Tolkien on fairy stories.
So I guess
yes, we definitely do have to ask that question in an extraordinarily serious.
And Peterson's like, I'm not going to agree with you there, but we'll keep the conversation going. And
one of the things that we might want to do, if we can figure out how to do it, is also to have a discussion with Roland Griffith.
Okay.
Back to the psychedelic. So we're gonna have to do more work in the psychedelic space. And when it comes to those of us in the church, we'll talk about Anselman in the comments section here. We'll talk about Jonathan Pajot. We in the church are have a fair amount of skepticism about this chemical route to God.
Do you know Roland Griffith's work?
Not as well as you, obviously.
Okay, well, he's been investigating psychedelics with psilocybin.
Yeah,
and he's a very solid scientist.
Yeah, I've heard people talk about psilocybin. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, well,
because my fear with these psychedelics is that we're stumbling into a category mistake.
There's a mystery there that's virtually unfathomable. And Griffiths is a very, very solid scientist, and that's another place that would make an interesting. But it's relevant to this point because there are. I think the reason that there has to be a religious domain is because religious questions will never go away. Well, and so even if you get rid of the answers, you can't get rid of the questions.
But you never want to get rid of the questions. I would argue that is that's my big argument about everything. Is it
okay? Go back to the other conversations. We know what is true. Well, what is true? It's from science. And in what domain? In what P is that scientific thing true? It's true in the propositional. And it's true because there's this correspondence between this word and between this physical aspect. And again, that's extraordinarily powerful. And one of the true blessings of the Enlightenment was the kind of discipline employed to get very clear on a whole bunch of things and to sort of get the cruft out of that and to have a very solid range of knowledge propositionally, procedurally, that we could engage. Now keep that in mind when he's about to talk about this stuff.
That we have the questions. I would argue that's my big argument about everything, is that we have to encourage questioning. In fact, that's what education should be based on. It should be based on answers. It should be based on questions.
Is water H2O? I think we should say yes. Is there a carbon atom in water? I think the answer is no. That's what modernity is good at. That's what this propositional space is good at. And so, well, then what kind of statement is he just making here? This is something like scientistic superstition, I would argue. It's all about the questions. Oh, please.
So I don't think I have no desire to get rid of those questions. Like, why, if you want to call it, why are we here?
Yes.
I would argue the why questions ultimately, however, the difference may be, and I know Richard has gotten involved in this too, because he wrote the foreword for one of my books, but the why questions are really all how questions.
Really? The why questions are really all how questions? How about the should questions? Are those how questions too? Again, I hear this and it's like, I'd set my hair on fire if I had any left.
They only remain why questions if you believe there's some fundamental purpose.
Now, again, keep this in mind, because what he just said right here, he's about to forget just a minute or two later.
And since there's no evidence of that, ultimately, when you ask why are we here, it really means how are we here. When you ask why does your heart pump blood, it doesn't mean that there's someone made up. It means what are the biochemical processes by which your heart allows your body to.
Okay. Why are we here? No, wrong question. I thought questions were the whole thing. No. How are we here? Oh, okay. Remember, put flag in it.
Okay, so all right, so let me respond to that a bit, and I understand your point, and take it very seriously. And so, but what I've been looking at, because I do look at this biologically to begin with, because I try to look at things scientifically insofar as the science allows those things to be viewed.
Okay, well,
and so to the degree that I can look at religious matters from a biological perspective, I do that because it's simpler. Okay, so I believe that the religious instinct
and I think he's right. It is simpler.
Manifests itself in a I believe that the religious instinct manifests itself in a variety of fundamental motivations, but they're abstract motivations to some degree. So the experience of awe, that's a major one. The experience of beauty, that's another one. The experience of admiration and the desire to imitate, those are crucial. And so one of the things that I would point out, you can tell me what you think about this, and I've been trying to formalize this idea, and I don't know its extent. So I look at Christianity in particular, although not uniquely Christianity, but Christianity in particular, as a thousands of years investigation into the structure of the abstracted ideal to imitate.
Right there, we get the best definition of Jordan Peterson's relationship with Christianity. He just laid it out right there. That's exactly right. And people are like, where is Jordan with respect to Christianity? It's right. Let's get my finger right. It's right there. It's just bang. Put it there in a sentence.
Struck a thousands of uniquely. So I look at Christianity in particular, although not uniquely Christianity, but Christianity in particular, as a thousands of years investigation into the structure of the abstracted ideal to imitate.
Now, maybe we should say that this is Jordan's propositional definition of Christianity.
So imagine we imitate those we admire. Okay, but we're abstract creatures, so we want to know what's the essence of what should be imitated itself.
It's not just that we're abstract creatures. We have to use abstraction. Again, back to the world is too big for us, combinatorial explosion, all of this cognition stuff. We have to abstract things out of the world in order to manage complexity too large for us to handle in moments in time and space.
Now, we investigate that. It's not all explicit. We have to represent it in music. We have to represent it in art. We have to represent it in architecture, because we're hitting at it from multiple different domains. And that is a reductionistic argument, right? It says nothing to do about divinity itself.
Sure.
It's purely psychological or biological argument.
Well, where I would disagree with you, and I like the way you've described it in many ways, but where I disagree with you, I guess, would be the word investigation. My problem with Christianity, and I've said this, I've debated once at Yale many years ago the theology, and I've argued that, and I've argued with theologians. I've said, give me an example in the last 400 years of a contribution of theology to knowledge.
What does he mean by knowledge? Oh, wait a minute.
And you know what they all say? What do you mean by knowledge?
Why would they ask that? This is exactly this question about propositional truth. Because he's saying, science, it's all propositional. This is what we're looking for. Okay? Now, don't forget that thing I asked you to remember, because we're coming up to it.
Now, if you ask what do you mean by theology?
Well, okay, maybe, but I would argue
because I would point.
Now he's right here, being himself. He's owning it. He's in the moment. He's in his flow state.
Point to Nietzsche and Jung.
Yeah, okay, but I would say if you asked a psychologist or a chemist or a biologist, what contributions and all, they list these things.
And they'd list them propositionally.
The point is that my problem with Christianity is it stopped asking questions. It stopped being an investigation, and it was a dictum. Here's the answer.
Yes.
Don't ask any more questions, and that is
Yes.
the antithesis of what I exist for. So I think that's probably
Look,
What did he just say?
look.
more investigation, and it was a dictum. Here's the answer.
Yes.
Don't ask any more questions, and that is
Yes.
the antithesis of what I exist for.
Of what he exists for. Sounds awfully purposive to me. It sounds to me like he imagines he has a reason for being. And is this just, at what level is this reason for being instantiated?
So I think that answer.
Yes.
Don't ask any more questions, and that is
Yes.
the antithesis of what I exist for. So.
As C.S. Lewis would say, he's finding his chest. But remember what he just finished saying over here.
And I know Richard has gotten involved in this too, because he wrote the foreword for one of my books. But the why questions are really all how questions.
In other words, why questions are really all how questions. But over to here.
By theology.
Well, okay, maybe, but I would argue
because
if you
I
asked
would
a chemist,
point to Nietzsche and Jung.
Yeah, okay, but I would say if you asked a psychologist, is it?
Yeah.
My problem with Christianity is it stopped asking questions. It stopped being an investigation, and it was a dictum. Here's the answer.
Yes.
Don't ask any more questions, and that is
Yes.
the antithesis of what I exist for. So I think that's probably...
Look, factor analytic studies of religion reveal something like two factors. There's a dogmatic element and there's a spiritual element. And if you do large scale surveys of people now, you see that their faith in the dogmatic element has declined substantially, but their spiritual claims have not.
But again,
And right here is, in many ways, where we're dealing with the propositional. And a lot of what happened in theology in the late modern era was they tried to do things, think about Schleiermacher. They tried to do things that would reduce the dogma out of Christianity, to get all of the propositional statements out of it. That's what a lot of liberal theology attempted to do. It's get the propositional statements out of it. And so then, of course, fundamentalism comes back in and says, whoa, no. And then they, nail down the propositional statements and say 6,000 years. And, they just nail down a bunch of these statements. It's completely understandable sociological response to what's going on. But it all revolves around these questions about these ways of knowing. And the question is, ways of knowing what? Now, his idea of, all why questions are really just how questions in disguise. That is seriously scary stuff, because you've just thrown out morality. You really have. Because along with why is why not? And why should you build? They were talking about a hydrogen bomb. Why should you really build a hydrogen bomb? No, those are only how questions, which gets back to Jordan Peterson's point of maybe we should ask the why question sometimes. Should we take this virus and this bat virus, this coronavirus, and develop it into something that could be transmissible between humans? No, don't ask that why question. Just how about the how question? Oh. So this propositional way of knowing is a really important conversation. And it's been beneath the surface of the major war in Western Christianity over the last 200 years, which has been the modernism, fundamentalism debate. Part of this pointed out by Darwin, by the rise of science, by the rise of propositional truths, which sometimes are in are in competition or contradictory to other propositional statements that you find in the Bible, let's say. And again, the subtraction story basically says, well, we had all these assumptions, and then we just, realized that Noah's flood couldn't account for the Grand Canyon, yada, yada. No, it can, and then off you go. But here's the difficult question. The reading of the Bible all along the way continued to develop as the other philosophy was developing as well. And the reason you know that is if you read Augustine or Origen or even someone like Calvin, there were these felt tensions between certain propositions and others the church had been dealing with all along. Again, back to the Galileo question, where Galileo wasn't at odds with the Bible. He was at odds with Aristotle. And, this is well known, yet it's usually trotted out. Well, let's talk about fairy tales. Well, why is the subtraction story the fairy tale that it is? And I don't mean that pejoratively. I mean it quite... A fairy tale is mythology, and so is the subtraction story. Now, it may be right, it may be wrong. There's a degree of wisdom, and I can certainly understand why the subtraction story arose the way it did. What do I mean by the subtraction story? The idea that it's all just superstition, and the more science we knew, well, then suddenly we could just lay all that stuff to bed and it'll all go away. And Peterson's point with Krauss is it's not going away, and it's never going to go away because there are some category questions. And a lot of the mappings of these categories very much line up along the lines of Vervaeke's 4 Ps here, which is why I paused the one video that I sat down and said I should really do another commentary video on Vervaeke Peterson, but I couldn't just leave the Krauss stuff alone. It's just way too tasty.
What I mean?
It's about embodying it. It's about establishing a relationship with it. It's about worshiping it.
It's about taking it into your identity.
That's the worship, I think.
I think it is.
Jonathan described worship as celebration. So it's a celebration of it.
And attention.
And reverence. Well, reverence for sure. But the celebration part is interesting because what you celebrate is what you hold in highest esteem. And to hold something in highest esteem is to pursue it in the hopes of embodying it. And that's worship.
Maybe this is to your point about worship. We've lost the depth of celebration. We have reduced it.
You see it in black gospel music, don't you? And then it runs into rock and roll from there. And then you get stadiums full of people experiencing it without noticing what they're doing.
When Peterson went to Liberty University, it was fascinating because some of the comments that he made was he was very moved by the celebration, by the worship. And, I know every now and then someone jumps onto the church channel, is horrified by what they find going on at Living Stones. And they expect to go to like St. Elijah Orthodox in Oklahoma City, which I subscribe to because they have some really good there's some really good teachings on the Gospel of John there. But it's a little different at Living Stones. We're just brimming with authenticity here.
Well, I felt that spirit when I went to a Leonard Cohen show when he stood up and everyone clapped and he sings Hallelujah or is it The Apocalypse? I think that's the song. He's got a couple, him and Johnny Cash in his later years, got a couple of songs that put you in that space right away.
But and I agree. I think that is a version of celebration. But the problem with that is it's been too located in its ontological locus is entertainment.
Yes, you're right. Exactly, John. Entertainment. It's like, no, it's enthusiasm.
Yes, and theos.
Well, he's about to make the point I was just going to make.
Be possessed by the God. And that's what I was trying to get at, right? In celebration.
We don't even notice when it happens. That's what a stadium is, too, when you cheer when someone puts the soccer goal through the net.
Of course it is. And
hey, look at that man's aim. Yeah. Couldn't we all aim like that? And wouldn't that be wonderful? Yes. And we'll do the wave to that. And don't we notice that we're worshiping God? No, because we've killed our religion by presuming it was a set of axiomatic set of presuppositions and listening to the 19th century rationalist atheists.
Well, what we've done
Rant.
is we have confused modernity's understanding of religion with the phenomena, which is, I think, a fundamental mistake.
No, with our blind critique.
See, and this question of who's responsible for the corruption of religion with modernity. Now, again, now the Orthodox and the Roman Catholics, well, the Orthodox especially, can stride in here and say, ha ha, ha, you Protestants. And the Roman Catholics are like, well, we tried to fight it with the Council of Trent. And the Orthodox will say, no, you accommodated to it with the Council of Trent. But the Orthodox are using the internet.
Of the phenomenon, because first of all, we have to make the phenomenon trivial and then critique it without noticing things like the spirit in black gospel music.
I think
and taking that seriously.
Yeah. I like your reformulation. I think that's better said.
Thank you.
So to go back, if consciousness and this kind, so there's a knowing that is dependent on your state of consciousness. There's a knowing through consciousness, and that's what I call perspectival knowing. What consciousness does is it foregrounds some things, backgrounds others, makes things things salient. So it's doing, if you'll allow me a term I've coined, it's doing salience landscaping for you. And what that does is
is that drawing things to your attention?
Yes, drawing things to your attention.
But your attention always also does that. So is that part of that? Because you kind of choose where your attention goes.
You choose it,
but sort of, right? Or you follow
participate
it.
in it. You participate in attention. That's what I was saying. You don't just attend and you don't just receive. You participate. There's both, and they use these metaphors without, I think, fully unpacking them. There's the top down and bottom up.
Do you think
aspects.
is that participatory attention akin to the dance between revelation and criticism? So is it revelation and dialogical evaluation that constitutes the participatory element of attention?
Yeah. Well, I think what it's doing is I'll speak more the theological language. It's realizing. So there's attention, right, is doing something like prioritization, relevance realization, right, in the dialogue between imagination, where we stop thinking of imagination as just images, useless images in our head.
It's helpful to just note the Great War between Owen Barfield and C.S. Lewis in their early days, I believe, was just over this point. Because Lewis was much more of a rationalist at that point. I think you're probably still in again, Michael L. would know this better because he's read the Great War. I haven't read the Great War. But I believe it was just over this point about how does the imagination function? And it was Barfield who came in on the side of the imagination and finally convinced Lewis that, no, imagination is not just simply the dismissive concept of what Krauss calls a fairy tale. The imagination is deeply important in how we frame the world.
Use it the way Corbin uses it, imaginal. And this is what's coming out in Friston's predictive processing. Imagination it permeates your perception. It's permeating it's right to say that.
And this, I think of Roger Scruton and Jordan Peterson's conversation, which again was one of my favorite ones that's online, where Peterson says, well, we don't see the world directly. We see basically low resolution cartoons, and there's a great deal of projection that's going on there. And I think that's true of Vervaeke's use of the imagination here.
I'm as much.
That's why Jung said we live to dream.
Well, but the thing, and there's something true about that. But I want to caveat it, because people will say it's all an hallucination. No. It's not.
No, it's not.
Most of the predictions.
But that's weird. Yeah.
Most of the predictions
are accurate.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
So it can't be just a dream.
When I moved my finger to touch the space bar to pause this video, it's not just a dream. It's an accurate prediction in my mind. And again, this is not happening consciously. It just because I'm in a, when I'm really getting into some of this, it is a bit of a flow state. And again, this is why, I do this conversation was in many ways shamanic, and many of you bore witness to that.
Exactly. So you've got imagination, if you'll allow me the spatial language, coming down and out. And
right,
then,
that's right. And it covers what's out there. And we see the imagination, but it pertains to the reality.
Yes, there has to be remember we talked about
what we're doing is continually adjusting the imagination to the reality.
That's the dialogos. And the prioritization is the way of adjusting.
So we see the map, we don't see the territory, but we also see is that right? We see the map, we don't see the territory, but
it's AR. It's augmented reality, although I would use a word other than reality, but augmented is it's in a sense what they're trying to do with AR.
We also see the errors in the map.
Right.
We see the map and the errors in the map, but we don't see the territory.
Yeah, but
the errors are where the territory pushes.
If you'll allow John to finish his statement.
Its nose through.
And what those errors do is they can, if we're properly receptive to the way the errors are deforming the map, they can turn it into a globe, and a globe is still not the thing, but it's damn better than a map. And so that there's a receptivity that's also important. I mean, it is definitely the case that insofar as our map is accurate, which means it's been generated as a consequence of a rectification of our previous errors, is that it is an adequate representation of the external of reality. It's an adequate representation of reality, which means we have molded ourselves to reality. See, this is also why I think, John, that I think that men and women select each other for manifestation of the logos.
Whoosh. And again, it's not off topic, but it's like, and again, this is a big area for Peterson. How does the story verse get into the matter verse? A lot of it through human mate selection.
Wow.
I mean, because I said
I know. That's Vervaeke is like, whoa! It's like in one of those scenes in Harry Potter where Dumbledore grabs Harry and he's got that thing that he just whooshes in and out. It's like, whoa, out we go.
This was a deep critique,
Yeah. Keep going.
It goes all the way to okay, so look at this. So men organize themselves into groups, and they take the quarterback out of the stadium on their shoulders, and they say, by doing so, cheerleaders, here's your chosen mate. And the cheerleaders jump up in the air with their legs spread and say, hooray, bring him to me. And isn't that the dialogue between men and women down the ages? And you might say, well,
I've been watching The Bachelor with my daughters again, and it's like, yeah, that's kind of the way it goes. Oh, what a metaphor. Sometimes I make metaphors in my sermons and people look at me like the pastor shouldn't make a metaphor like that, but that was a doozy.
Well, why would men vote for the stallion when they're not the stallion? And the answer is, well, it's better to be a follower of the stallion if you can't be the stallion than to not be at all.
And when will I release this with respect to? I did a conversation with Karen Wong. It might be up on her channel already, but this was exactly part of the point I was making with respect to Karen when we were talking about Jordan Peterson's idea of how the ideal judges us.
And I mean that in the deepest evolutionary sense as well. Or have I got something wrong? Because when I said this is the fundamental animating spirit, I really meant it. And so then if men and women are choosing each
in a Darwinian sense, again,
each other for manifestation of the logos, then that's the spirit that drives the evolution of consciousness. It's random.
John Vervaeke goes, let me catch up a little bit. We went to mate selection, and we went to quarterbacks, and we went to cheerleaders spreading their legs, and to voting up the beta males voting up the alpha male, and it's like, oh, shamanism.
It might be random variation on the option side, but that doesn't mean it's random variation on the selection side, obviously. And so then the question is, well, what are you selected for? I imagine your wife is pretty fond of you when you manifest that. Well, yes, I have a wife too. And
I don't think he was hearing him well at that point. But again, this has been a critical aspect of Jordan, and in some ways,
and understand her displeasure with my multiple shortcomings and justified displeasure, I might say. But
the first videos, I did quite a bit of speculation about what happened before this video thrown off. Maybe he had a fight with his wife. Could be too. I mean, I've been married 33 years this year, so I understand a little something about that.
But I'm sure that she's happy when you do manifest that part of you that you said you wanted to manifest.
But I get. Maybe I don't get you. I see. What I
Whoa!
see is you're mapping the receptivity and the selection onto sort of masculine and feminine, maybe sort of yin and yang in a Taoist thing. But if I was to respond as a Taoist, I would say, but can't I have that relationship also with you? Does it have to be necessarily embodied in a sexual difference?
I think it's also embodied in that that it goes all the way to the bottom wherever you look.
Well, wouldn't that suggest then that something like the Taoist notion of yin and yang, therefore, is a more fundamental representation of the reality, precisely because it applies to more cases?
Well, more fundamental than what?
See, and I think John has sort of switched over to a, dare I say, a dogmatic religious frame of Taoism, and Jordan is sort of in the dogmatic Darwinian frame where something like mate selection is fundamental and at the bottom much more than, let's say, a abstraction such as chaos and order. Chaos and order are both abstractions. They're far more abstract than human reproduction, which is obviously very physical.
So the idea,
and it's like we kind of lost each other in this. What they call it when, I can't think of it right now, in Harry Potter, when they grab onto this thing and they whoosh when they go off to some other place.
Of masculine and feminine. I understand.
That's certainly possible. That's certainly possible. I mean,
it's like back in the old days. Remember when you had a modem? Some of you don't know that, but if you're old like me, you do. Because back when you sort of lost the handshake and you have to redial and try and get back with that bulletin board server.
I think reality is the battle of good and evil against a background of chaos and order.
So the chaos and order would map quite readily. Sorry,
go ahead, please.
I was just saying, I can see that in sort of that's a very doubt. The reason I'm saying
order is the map that you're describing, right? Because it, insofar as it's in concordance with reality, it's a map that it enables us, when we apply it, to get what we desire.
Of course. And
then disorder emerges when that prediction, it isn't just a prediction because it's predicated on desire, which is where the cognitive scientists went wrong, because it's not just expectation, it's desire.
I think we'll pause it there. And so this was number 5, and we're at 1 hour and 19 minutes, almost 1 hour and 20 minutes out of 2 hours and 30 minutes. So, and if I keep slicing in new videos that drop, I assume next Monday it might be the psychedelic video that drops. But I've got vacations coming up, and I tend to lose interest. So I don't know, Sam and Hank, how you're going to split the difference between 4 and 10. But, when I finally get out to the Chicago estuary, we'll be looking for some deep dish pizza. So anyway, I hope this was helpful. It's probably as good a place to stop as any right now. Let me know what you think in the comments.